In common use for lawful purposes. Well, that's the criteria that must be met, and the gun grabbers hate that. In common use for lawful purposes was first recognized in the 1939 Supreme Court case of the United States versus Miller, and more recently recognized in the U.S. Supreme Court case District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008. Now, it's now considered binding precedent on Second Amendment issues in the United States. Shall not be infringed should be enough to keep the angry freedom haters quiet, but no. If they're not sucking every last bit of American spirit out of their fellow citizens, their work is not done. Now, although the gun grabbers want desperately to ban the AR-15 and other commonly owned semi-automatic rifles, they understand that they can't pretend it's not in common use anymore. However, they continue to try and continue to get laughed out of court. In Miller versus Bonta 2021, U.S. District Judge Roger Benitez ruled that California's ban on AR-15 style rifles violated the Second Amendment. Benitez said, like the Swiss Army knife, the popular AR-15 rifle is a perfect combination of home defense weapon and homeland defense equipment, good for both home and battle. The AR-15 is the kind of versatile gun that lies at the intersection of the kinds of firearms protected under District of Columbia versus Heller and United States versus Miller. Yet the state of California makes it a crime to have an AR-15 type rifle. Therefore, this court declares the California statutes to be unconstitutional. In Barnett versus Raul, just a couple years later, in 2023, in a court case involving semi-automatic rifles, the court said that the AR-15 style rifles are among the most popular arms produced, accounting for nearly half the rifles produced in 2018 and nearly 20% of all firearms of any type sold in 2020. This court concluded that these rifles are in common use and protected by the Second Amendment. Now, these are just a couple of examples. So although the gun grabbers like Everytown, Giffords Group, and those angry demanding moms continue to push propaganda terms like assault weapon and weapons of war, their childish fear campaigns fall on deaf ears. The reality is nobody's buying what they're selling anymore. Now, this is why these groups need a constant influx of big donor money. Unlike national gun rights organizations like GOA, the anti-gun groups simply do not have the same dedicated support from average citizens. Now, in other words, without big politically motivated donations from the left-wingers like Michael Bloomberg, the misguided gun grabbers would have to go back to tending to their herb gardens and watching daytime soap operas. Now, in common use means these firearms are widely owned, and data indicates that over 30 million modern sporting rifles are in circulation since 1990. Home security cameras, exercise bikes, smart home devices, and tablets like the very popular iPad are all owned in similar numbers to modern sporting rifles. Are we to suggest that these things are not in common use? Now, many people own swimming pools, but there are only half as many privately owned swimming pools as there are modern sporting rifles. Should we ban swimming pools or pretend that they're not commonly owned? Heck, there are only 2 million to 5 million electric vehicles on the road, far less than modern sporting rifles, and we can see that they're becoming considered a common use item. In fact, the Biden administration thought they were in such common use that grants were given for charging stations to accommodate the large number of EVs. Well, it seems Democrats use in common use as it suits them politically. So the angry gaggle of anti-gun misfit moms are stopped in their tracks when they're confronted with the in common use standard. Well, what do when they can't argue against in common use? Well, they shift gears, of course, and try desperately to make the modern sporting rifle appear to be the firearm of choice for unlawful purposes. Remember, they have to fabricate an argument against in common use for lawful purposes. You may remember the Las Vegas killing when the media failed to cover details on the killer, but was more than willing to offer up photos of several alleged rifles used in the attack, all displayed in what we were told was the untouched crime scene. Now, there were several modern sporting rifles strewed about, some with a smattering of bullet casings surrounding them, and a magazine delicately teetering on the edge of a bathtub, while an unaffected bipod miraculously straddled the leg of the alleged killer. The display of firearms was impressive, but questioned by many who believe the photos were purely for propaganda purposes, just to create imagery that would convince people that these rifles are largely being used unlawfully. Well, the aftermath of incidents like this are a clear indicator of how the gun grabbers portray firearms for the purpose of gun legislation support. We watch them repeatedly try to undermine the commonly used for lawful purposes standard in their pursuit to regulate, restrict, and register firearms and accessories, when in fact, the unlawful use of firearms is a mere fraction of the overall usage of firearms. In fact, several studies have shown that firearms are used up to 2.5 million times each year in America for defensive purposes, and are very effective when it comes to stopping violent crime and saving lives. Since the use of hands, fists, feet, and knives amount to 4 times more the number of deaths than modern sporting rifles, it's pretty clear that guns aren't the problem. The gun grabbers' arguments completely fall apart when we simply look at the numbers and apply some common sense. But that seems to be a practice that's lost on the angry moms and the anti-gun lobbyists. Even if the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed wasn't enough, the in common use for lawful purposes standard should put the argument to rest. But of course, the anti-gun crowd has never let common sense or the Bill of Rights get in their way before. Why should they start now? Not only will GOA and GOF fight them back legislatively and in the courts, we will always call out their hypocrisy, their lies, and misinformation. Thanks for watching Bullet Points. I'm Dan Wass for Gun Owners Foundation. You can find more Second Amendment content and updates at gunowners.com.